Hi. Welcome everyone to the October 350 Wisconsin monthly meeting. My name is Christina Cook. I'm a member of the monthly meeting team, and I believe the whole team is here tonight. Kelly Kearns, Marion Friedel, and online Lee Langford and Susan Nossel. So thanks to all of them for their help, and also a shout out to Julia Isaacs for helping us set up in the Friends Meeting House here. So go ahead to the next slide. Are you up for the land acknowledgement today? Or
That is correct.
okay,
That is correct.
Turn it over to you.
All right. Before we begin, let's ground ourselves wherever we are and take 2 deep breaths. This Four Lakes region, known as Tijop in the language of the Ho-Chunk people, is land that they have continuously inhabited since time immemorial. I'd like to acknowledge the role the United States government and settlers from Europe played in repeated but ultimately unsuccessful efforts to forcibly remove all Ho-Chunk people from these lands. I call on us to further acknowledge that the impact and trauma of colonization exists to this day and needs to inform our understanding of becoming allies with the Ho-Chunk Nation. May we find inspiration in their resilience and their vision of stewardship of the land.
Thank you, Lee. All right. So here's our overview for tonight's meeting. We're still in our opening. Want to extend an extra warm welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time. We hope you feel welcome here at 350 Wisconsin and our monthly meetings. So we'll be dropping a code of conduct into the chat, some principles that we want to abide by to make sure this is a welcoming and safe place for everyone. And if you have any questions about that, you can contact the monthly meeting team. So we'll next have some short breakout groups, just a chance to chat with folks and socialize a bit, and then go into our featured speaker for the evening, and then have some announcements and some optional discussion time at the end. So with that, Lee, if you want to go forward a slide, the discussion question, if you need one, is if you could dine with an environmental leader or activist, who would it be and why? And so in a moment, you should be invited to a breakout group. If you're on Zoom, people in person can break up and talk amongst yourselves and discuss either this question or just kind of whatever's on your heart at the moment around climate activism. I've been thinking a lot about the change of seasons, obviously, as fall is here. So whatever it is, hopefully you have a chance to connect with some folks and have a little conversation. Susan, is everyone back online? Susan and Lee?
I think so.
Okay, great. So Lee, if you want to go forward a slide, I think we are to the introduction of our speaker. So I'm going to turn it over to Marion.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marion Friedel, and I want to just thank our speaker, Leah Horowitz. Leah is an associate professor with a joint appointment in the UW-Madison Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. She teaches Indigenous Peoples and the Environment and Climate Change Governance. And tonight she's going to be speaking about just transitions, and we want to just welcome her to 350 Wisconsin. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Marion. Okay, yes, I'm being recorded. Now I have to find my slide. Oh, here we go. Share my screen. If that worked. And there we go. All right. Can everyone see my slides? Or is that working? Is that working?
Not yet.
Fun.
Not yet.
I'm not sure my slides being shared. No.
Whoa, I haven't seen them yet.
Let's try that again.
Yeah.
Zoom.
Yeah. What happened to Zoom? Yeah, I tried to share. There we go.
There we
Now
go.
it's working.
Looks good.
Come back. Okay, now. get rid of this. And there we go. We good? Yeah, we're good. Okay, awesome. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. So I apologize for the boring title, but hopefully the talk will be interesting enough to make up for it. Right. So I'm going to talk about climate justice, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to start by just introducing environmental justice in general. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but just quickly, I'll run through this concepts. So when the environment gets degraded, as you all know, groups who depend disproportionately on natural resources, and in part that's because they have less access to other sorts of resources and other economic opportunities, and often that's because of racial and gender inequities in the broader society, they're the ones who suffer the most. Sorry. I'm getting a pop-up saying the host spotlighted your video for everyone. Unmute your microphone if you want to speak. Ignore that. Okay, right. So on top of the greater impacts, in fact, their resources, those local environments are indeed the ones that get degraded more than others, because people with power and privilege don't want that pollution in their own backyards. Now, incidentally, the Midwest has, as you probably know, has a disproportionate number of coal-fired power plants, which obviously also increased climate change. And most of those plants are near neighborhoods of people of color and of people living in poverty. And they face the risks of health impacts and death from the particulate emissions, which can cause damage to the lungs, heart, and brain. So climate justice is related to environmental justice, and it brings in new dimensions as well. For one thing, there's a huge time lag associated with climate change. So we're making future generations pay for our fossil fuel usage today, and that creates what's called intergenerational equity issues. Not to mention the rights of humans versus non-human species. Polar bears aren't the ones burning fossil fuels, except maybe these guys, but they and a lot of other species are suffering from human fossil fuel use. And of course, there's the geographical question as well, because the people who are going to be the most hurt by climate change are those who are already the most vulnerable to hardship. And those are people who live in the Ganges Delta, for example, or drought-prone areas of Africa, etc. Within the US, one group within our own country, a group that's being particularly hard hit by climate change are American Indians. So for one thing, people who live a traditional lifestyle tend to rely a lot on wild foods. And they rely on these not only for food, but often those species play an important role in their culture. So around the Great Lakes area, one of the most important foods is wild rice, manuman, which also has a spiritual significance. But wild rice is a sensitive plant. It needs just the right conditions to grow. And so as the climate warms, the milder winters and the heavy spring rains can actually destroy the crop. And other indigenous groups have noticed that the animals that they hunt, their migration patterns are changing because of climate change. More dramatically, natural disasters or unnatural disasters, because they're made worse by anthropogenic climate change, disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. So Hurricane Katrina, as you probably all remember, destroyed New Orleans in 2005, and it kind of woke the world up to these kinds of disproportionate impacts of climate change because it affected African Americans in particular. In fact, African Americans were about 4 times more likely to die because of Hurricane Katrina. And then we're whites. Now, of course, natural disasters have always occurred, and climate scientists can't definitively say that any one of them, any one storm was the direct result of climate change, but we do know that storms are getting more frequent and more severe. And obviously that's bad news. But those communities are fighting back. In 2007, the UN Conference of the Parties was held in Bali, and climate justice organizations gathered there as well. And by then they had a global network and they had a slogan, Climate Justice Now. So they articulated a set of demands. Those were reduce consumption in the global north, huge financial transfers from the north to the south, and they argued those financial transfers were both fair and necessary because of the North's historical responsibility for the fossil fuel consumption that had led to climate change in the first place. And so they said that those transfers could be financed by taking money from, for example, military budgets, or by taxing fossil fuel use, by canceling developing nations' debts. Another demand was leaving fossil fuels in the ground and investing instead in energy efficiency and community-based renewable energy forms. They also demanded rights-based resource conservation that would not take resources away from Indigenous peoples and other communities that rely on natural resources, but instead would strengthen their rights to land and forests and water. And finally, they demanded support for sustainable family farming and food sovereignty. In other words, right, strengthening countries' capacity to feed themselves rather than relying on imports of foods that was produced and shipped using lots of fossil fuels. And in 2013, a new network was formed called the Climate Justice Alliance, and that brought together the various climate justice organizations and communities that were fighting local issues into a translocal force. Some of the actions that they are still taking today include what they call just recovery, and that involves helping communities that have been impacted by climate disasters, helping them to, hurricanes, floods, and fires, helping those communities to rebuild in a sustainable way that the communities themselves control. They also do things like helping communities achieve food sovereignty through urban gardens, and also fighting oil and gas pipelines, and trying to persuade banks and philanthropists to invest money in communities instead of giving or loaning money to organizations or operations that are promoting the capitalist systems that are contributing to climate change. But one of the things I want to talk about today is the just transition. So just like with environmental justice and climate justice, the actual energy transition away from fossil fuels and towards alternatives itself can exacerbate pre-existing social inequities if it's not done carefully. And these justice issues kind of break down into two distinct areas that generally impact two distinct types of communities. So on the one hand, you have communities that have long relied on the extraction of those fossil fuels, the prime example being coal. And as society transitions away from those fuels, they are losing their jobs. So the transition away from fossil fuels has negative implications for those workers and their families. And on the other hand, the transition to alternatives to fossil fuels, like electric cars, solar panels, and batteries for storing all that electricity, that requires enormous quantities of what are known as energy transition minerals, or ETMs. And that also means mining, among other things. So mining is kind of a double-edged sword there. So first, I'd like to talk about the jobs that will be lost. And again, coal mining is a big one. So in the US, coal is mined in 25 states that fall into three main regions. And all of those regions also have some of the highest poverty rates in the US. Most of that coal gets used for electricity generation. But nowadays, coal-fired power plants are being shut down, and no new ones are really being built. The use of coal for electricity generation declined, for example, 29% between 2007 and 2015. And as you can see in the graph, the number of operational coal mines fell by more than half in roughly that same time period. So not surprisingly, coal mining jobs are disappearing. And that impacts not only the individual families, but also the state governments in those states. Let's zoom in on Kentucky for a moment. Kentucky has relied on coal for its economy ever since they started mining coal in Kentucky in 1790. But then between 1990 and 2019, production dropped nearly 80%. And employment in the coal industry fell from over 75,000 in 1948 to 50,000 in the late 1970s, down to 6,000 in 2019, and it's just kept going down, as you can see in that graph. Now, coal was always a mixed bag for Kentucky communities anyway. You've probably heard of black lung disease, which you can only get from inhaling coal dust, and 16% of coal miners have it. But there are also much higher rates of heart and kidney disease and cancer. 14.4% of people living near mountaintop removal areas versus 9.4% of people elsewhere in Appalachia. Birth defects are 42% higher, not to mention water pollution, and all of that adds up to $75 billion per year in public health expenses. Coal did, at least it used to, provide livelihoods, which paid pretty well in a state where pretty much the only other industries are horse racing and bourbon. At least that's what my cab driver told me when I was there last year. And coal mining provided tax revenue to the state as well. And that revenue fell from $20.5 million in 2011 down to $8.9 million just 5 years later in 2016. So as you can see, here's Appalachia, right? Sort of this general area, and there's Kentucky. And you'll recall from the earlier map of coal mines, there's actually a lot of overlap with the opioid dispensing in that region where people have lost those coal mining jobs. Not necessarily a coincidence. Now, other workers are impacted by the energy transition as well, but in their case, it's not the transition away from fossil fuels, but the transition to fossil-free options that impacts them. An important example is the auto workers industry. So you may have heard about the United Auto Workers strike, United Auto Workers Union strike in 2023. And a large part of that actually had to do with their concerns about the transition to electric cars. Because electric cars can be built by a lot fewer workers than it takes to build a gas car. Electric vehicles don't have things like mufflers, catalytic converters, fuel injectors, etc. So the plants that make those things are eventually going to have to shut down. And any change to the status quo is almost by definition going to benefit some, and it's going to harm others. In other words, in the energy transition, there are going to be winners and losers. So some jobs will be created, jobs like installing and maintaining renewable energy infrastructure, but others will be lost. So an interesting dimension of that labor environmentalist relationship around the energy transition is industrial pollution, because that pollution impacts not only the environment and local communities, it also impacts the workers from those communities. And more often than not, those are communities of color. So the Just Transition Alliance was created in 1997 to fight against industrial activity that pollutes the environment and harms human health, including the health of that industry's employees. And they believe, in their words, and I quote, "A healthy economy and a clean environment can and should coexist." And a crucial part of that is that they believe that workers and communities should be the ones determining what that economy should look like. So not all labor unions are anti-environment. Some actually ally with environmentalist organizations to work towards a green economy. This is the goal, for example, of the Blue-Green Alliance, which happens to be based in Minneapolis. That organization is really active in trying to protect workers' jobs and seize the opportunities that are presented by the efforts to mitigate climate change. Besides workers, other groups are also at risk from the transition to electric vehicles and renewable energy, particularly because those technologies require a lot of minerals that the older technologies don't require. And minerals means mining, and mining inevitably means impacts on local communities. So first of all, how much more minerals are we talking about? Well, this figure shows the difference between an electric car and a conventional gas car, as you can see up top here. And also it shows the difference between wind, solar, and nuclear, and coal and natural gas on the other hand. So as you can see, the clean and green technologies are going to need a lot more copper, lithium, nickel, manganese, graphite, and all the rest of those minerals, right? And demand is growing. So for example, there were about 7 million EVs on the roads in 2019, and by 2030, that's expected to grow to 200 million. So as the demand for these technologies grows, so will the demand for those minerals known as energy transition minerals, or ETMs. So for example, the demand for lithium by 2040 is expected to be 42 times what the demand was in 2020. Okay, so where are these minerals coming from then? Within the US, as you can see in this figure, most mines and most proposed mines are located near American Indian reservations, particularly those ones that are mines for energy transition metals or minerals. One prominent example of a project like that is the Thacker Pass lithium mine in Nevada. And this project is on Paiute and Shoshone traditional lands, and it's located about 40 miles from the Fort McDermott Reservation. The mine site has cultural and religious significance and also particular historical significance because on that very place in 1865, US soldiers massacred Paiute people. And because of the significance of this site, for those multiple reasons, tribal governments and indigenous groups opposed the project. Environmentalists also oppose it because that area is habitat for sage grouse and pronghorn antelope. So they worked together to sue the company, but their suit was denied by a federal appeals court in 2023, and construction began that very same year, and production is projected to begin next year, 2026. All right, so what about outside of the US at a global scale? Well, this map shows that most of the mine sites where those energy transition minerals are located are again on or near the lands of indigenous peoples and or small scale subsistent farmers. So the yellow shows the percentage of indigenous lands here in these bar sort of pie charts. The green wedges are the farmers, small scale farmers lands, and the blue is both indigenous and small scale farmers. And it shows that those figures or statistics for each geographical region. And then the graph below shows by each mineral, which you probably can only see if you are on Zoom. So it shows the breakdown for each of those minerals. But again, in every case, the vast majority of the mine sites are located on indigenous and or subsistence farmers' lands, 69% of the total projects, actually. So this presents a further risk to communities that are already experiencing disproportionate impacts due to marginalization within the larger societies. So, for example, small farmers represent 40% of the world's population, but 80% of the communities that are experiencing food insecurity and hunger, and 70% of people living in extreme poverty. So mining threatens to take their land and contaminate their water. Well, one thing that can help ensure a more just energy transition, you might imagine, the first thing we might think of is recycling. Recycling minerals from old batteries rather than mining those minerals from the ground. And researchers are working on recycling technologies right now. Because while we already have technologies to recycle metals that we have historically used in large quantities, we don't have those kind of technologies for these specific energy transition metals. We've just never used them in such large quantities to make it worthwhile to recycle them. So this would involve things like taking old spent batteries and using the metals inside them to manufacture new batteries, which makes a lot of sense. But right now, because those batteries are just starting to come out in large numbers, we don't have a lot of old batteries to actually experiment with. That's expected to change around 2030 when a lot of those batteries are going to reach the end of their usable life. Now, the demand for those batteries is growing, expected to keep growing. And as per the graphs I showed earlier, the demand is projected to just keep growing kind of exponentially. So realistically, recycling is not going to be able to provide enough metal to meet all that demand. By some estimates, recycling could reduce demand for newly mined minerals by about 10% by 2040. Now, new battery designs are coming out that require lesser quantities of minerals. Some studies project that by 2050, each lithium-ion battery might need 23% less lithium. And there are also improvements being made in energy storage capacity, so that each battery could store more energy per kilogram of battery. And there are also improvements being made to battery life. And all of those technological improvements will reduce the demand for lithium, graphite, cobalt, and other minerals. Another strategy is to find alternatives to lithium, lithium being actually one of the most problematic energy transition minerals. And some researchers think that by 2030, lithium-ion batteries may no longer dominate the market. So researchers are working on developing batteries that rely instead on other minerals that are less damaging to the environment. For example, one model that's under development uses salt, just plain old table salt, sodium chloride. And what's a good place to find salt? Seawater, right? So a research team in Germany has developed a battery that actually uses seawater. So no need for mining lithium. There's another battery under development that uses glass with sodium ions mixed into it, which is much less environmentally destructive and actually more powerful than lithium-ion batteries as well, not to mention cheaper. So I hope that my talk today has left you with some food for thought about climate justice and just transitions, and also some ideas about work that's being done toward both of those goals and work that climate activists can support. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was really interesting. I'm wondering if the people in the room here at the Friends Meeting House, if you have any questions, if you could think about that. And on Zoom, if you could also, what should we do with the Zoom? Put them in the chat and pick them out. Okay. And Kelly will take the microphone around. So do we have any questions to start with? Yeah, John.
Yeah, Leah, thanks very much. Great presentation. I'm sure this is probably not an easy one to answer, but you're presenting some great data that has some longitudinality to it. How does this all fit within everything that's happening in our country and really in our world in the past year? I'm sure it's hard everything is happening so quickly, but just in terms of trends and perspectives and how they're changing. Any thoughts or feedback?
Yeah, it can get really discouraging. But the one thing I have to always remind myself is that we're not the only country in the world. And you can kind of forget that, right? When you're looking at the news and it just seems so enormous and overwhelming and horrifying. We're not the only country in the world, right? We're one country. And actually what's crazy is that China is just taking off. They're just leaving us in the dust. So they are really taking this seriously. They're dominating the EV market. They're dominating, solar power. They are really full steam ahead, just developing these new technologies. So, the market is not going to go away anytime soon, even though some elements would like it to, or they'd like to turn back the clock 40 years, which is what I keep feeling like is happening. It's like really bizarre, like time warp. But yeah, I mean, the market forces are such that coal is dead. I mean, it's not coming back, no matter how much people would like it to. It's just not economically viable anymore, right? They're just much more efficient ways of producing energy that aren't as, controversial and damaging. So yeah, so that these technologies are not going away. They're just going to keep developing. There's markets in Europe. There are markets in China. There are emerging markets in the BRICS, countries. So, we're not the only, I mean, I hear you about the US and we're just stymieing kind of, it feels like, but MIT researchers are still on this, they're still doing their thing and the market is not going away. Oh, sure. Let me stop sharing. It's probably the easiest thing. Sharing.
So a couple, two online questions about batteries. One, do you know how far away sodium ion batteries are from commercial viability?
I don't know that anybody knows that right now, unfortunately.
Yes,
Yeah.
still a ways then. And then are there any electrical vehicle battery companies or just generally people producing infrastructure that's non-fossil fuel based that are trying to source their materials more ethically? Is that even a thing?
There is, yeah. I have other slides on this that I have at my fingertips, so I don't have like all the details off the top of my head. But there are definitely efforts to trace the supply chains more carefully and kind of I mean, they're all voluntary, right? So there are obviously issues around voluntary agreements, not everybody being willing to sign on to them. But that's where we come in, right? We, the people, come in to put the pressure on companies. If the government's not going to do it, we need to be the ones creating the reputational incentive for them to actually be tracing their supply chains and, making sure they're ethically sourced minerals or materials that they're using. you know, that informal regulation can be really powerful.
Thank you. Thanks, Leah, for your presentation. My question is, can you talk about the most, say, effective strategy to support Indigenous people to protect their land?
Yeah, the most effective strategy is to listen and support what they're doing if they want you to, right? To just follow their leadership. And I think I studied the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that became problematic when a lot of activists came across who had different agendas from the tribes. And, you know, they wanted to take over and impose their agenda, whether it be anarchy, whether it be keep it in the ground. That wasn't necessarily their agenda. They just didn't want that pipeline there, right? So to actually do it in an ethical way, it's very simple. Just be humble and listen and ask them if you can help. And if they say yes, help them in the way that they want to be helped, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about the dynamic between an upfront damage versus damage that is scaled as for example, like an upfront damage in what was needed to build a battery versus the scaled damage of every gallon of oil you have to burn. I was curious how that interacts with the harm done to vulnerable communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these impossible questions, right? It's like, how do you evaluate the trade-off, having the imperative of having to stop climate change versus not wanting to harm already impacted communities? There are no simple answers to that. There are kind of places where they intersect. You don't have to mine lithium in a place that's sacred to Native peoples. There are other places to get lithium from. There's this kind of brine in Alabama, right? I think it's Alabama. Do you know about this? Where people actually want you to come and harvest it because it's not anything sacred to them and it's not impacting them. There are other sources of lithium. Trying to move to technologies that use seawater is a kind of a win-win situation, right? So there are definitely win-win situations. In terms of the sacrifices, yeah, I mean, these are tough questions, and it kind of depends on what you choose what you value more, I guess. But at the same time, I would say start with the win-win situations because there are certainly a lot of them. And, you know, there are no-go zones where you don't have to go there. Yeah.
So yeah, just one more question. You kind of touched on this a little bit, Leah, but the question was, are there any examples of safe mining, which I assume also mean like maybe less environmentally degrading? And I'd like to add to that, do you know of any examples of Indigenous nations that were able to kind of negotiate something on their terms for their land and potentially different outcomes for different groups?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not all Indigenous people are opposed to mining by any stretch of the imagination. So that's the kind of a two-part question. In terms of the environmental impacts, there's no zero impact mining. It just doesn't, no matter what anybody tells you, it does not exist, right? There are always impacts from mining. It's inevitable. And unforeseen impacts, accidents. No one predicts accidents. We always assume they're not going to happen and then they happen, right? It's kind of human nature maybe. But yeah, so there's no zero impact mining. We're definitely doing it better than we did 50 years ago when there were just no regulations. There was nothing to rein it in at all. So it's better. And it's better in places where there are good safeguards, there are good regulations, there is good pressure on the companies to do a good job. But yeah, there's no zero impact mining. In terms of the social impacts, which I guess was the second part of the question, yeah, or the social desirability of the mining. I mean, there are a lot of places in Canada, in remote and Aboriginal communities where it can be controversial. Sometimes part of the community is in favor, part of the community is against. Some communities are more favorable than other communities. It can cause stress within the community with some people wanting it, some people not. I mean, certainly the jobs and the income is attractive in a place where there's no other means of earning an income, right? You're way up north, remote places. Australia has done a really good job of, they've been forced to respect Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal people. So they do welcome, a lot of communities there welcome mining. And they gain a lot from it. They have positioned themselves to gain a lot of royalties from the mining, a lot of jobs. I mean, it's very different in different places around the world. So yeah, so a lot of Aboriginal people in Australia are very in favor of mining. Not all, but yeah, a lot.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Leah. That was great. Thanks for taking the Q&A. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Kelly, for announcements. Lee, can you put the slides up?
So we have a few announcements tonight, and I think first it's probably going to be Stephanie or Kristen. Kristen, are you on? So Stephanie.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we wanted to invite you to our upcoming event on October 19th. We Rise Together. It's a community gathering to join together in solidarity, and we think it's going to be a really wonderful afternoon at the Aldo Leopold Nature Center with guided nature hikes and reflections, some live music, some good food. It's free for everyone to attend, and we would love to see you there. We have sent out some emails to you all with links to RSVP, and we would like to know if you're coming. I think we'll also try to put those in the chat tonight. So yeah, we'd love to see you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And next, Brittany, I know you're online, so she's going to get us caught up on what's going on with line 5.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, this might be a little bit lengthy. I'm going to try to keep it as short as I can, though. So as most of you probably know, 350 Wisconsin is part of a legal challenge against the Wisconsin DNR's permitting for Enbridge Energy's Line 5 reroute. And this past week, the hearing wrapped up. So around 200 people gathered at Northwood Technical College in Ashland as the case kicked off with opening statements from the attorney teams and 46 public comments from individuals. In week 2, MEA and Clean Wisconsin experts pointed to failures by the Wisconsin DNR to protect clean water and healthy wetlands when the agency permitted Enbridge's plan. Testimony revealed one of the many reasons why the Wisconsin DNR never should have issued permits for the proposed reroute. And in that case, we're talking about the impact on wetlands. In week 3, the Bad River Band presented their case, and that began with Chairman Blanchard, followed by the Mashkazebe Natural Resources Department Director, Naomi Tillison. The chairman's testimony included powerful statements about the proposed reroute and the impact it would have on the band's way of life. And Director Tillison described the band's experience with 2 recent Enbridge projects on the reservation that both included missing baseline data, longer than expected periods of construction and restoration, and substantial impacts to wetlands despite the company's assurances. And then in weeks 4 and 5, despite overwhelming evidence from MEA's experts, Enbridge defended its proposal by arguing in part that the project would have no measurable impact on water quality in the area. And the Wisconsin DNR kept referring back to their EIS, although the Bad River Band has determined, we know that the reroute would impact their water quality standards. That is a very quick overview of what happened over the last, over a month, 5 weeks. And at the moment, we do not know when to expect a decision from the ALJ, but we will be sending out a more comprehensive update on what happened during the hearing in the coming weeks. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you, Brittany. That was really helpful. That was a really good summary. Next, I think Emily is going to tell us about some volunteer needs.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's time to start thinking about election season again. I'm sure we are all super happy about that. But 350 Wisconsin Action, which is our 501c4 sister organization that does political electoral work, is starting to think about the 2026 election cycle. That will include, of course, yet another Wisconsin State Supreme Court race, It will be a critical chance to flip the Wisconsin state legislature. And there will be a couple of very contentious U.S. Congress seats up for grabs, in addition to the gubernatorial race. So lots of really important stuff happening throughout the entire year. And we are looking for volunteers to join the political action team. And so that is the team that will help us determine which races we might want to endorse in. So all the way from local up to federal, and also help us shape where we're going to be focusing our on the ground efforts. So for the first good chunk of the year, you could expect roughly monthly-ish meetings, and then of course the closer we get to the election, that might pick up a little bit. So if this is something you are interested in or might want to learn more about, please shoot me an email.
Thanks, Emily. So next, I just want to let you know about the next monthly meetings. On November 3rd, Madeline Parra, who many of you probably know, she's with Indivisible, and she's going to speak to us about how to use some of Indivisible's organizational structure for climate work. And then on December 1, we're going to be having volunteer recognition. So please join us for those meetings. Both of those will likely be just on Zoom. Okay, next, we have our team meetings coming up as well. Most of our teams meet on Mondays, and Tuesdays, but we have others coming up as well. Next slide. And so you can see the people that you need to get in touch with if you want to join one of those teams. And now, Christina, you want to talk?
Yeah, I'll wrap things up. So that's technically the end of the main part of our meeting. So for those of you who I'll stand over here so I'm visible on the screen. For those of you who are ready to be done for the day, you can head out. But if you want to stick around for another couple minutes,